Hello and a warm welcome to Personal Finance. I'm Kukuletu Cele. Medical aid gap cover, that's the topic that we're tackling tonight. Medical aid is an expensive and often complicated purchase, but how much does it really cover us in the event that we need it most? And where does gap cover come in? And to demystify all of this for us this evening, I'm joined by Joanne Gloag, Executive of Admed at Guardrisk. Good to have you with us this evening.
Hi Gugu, thank you for having me.
Maybe if you can help us demystify this concept of gap cover that sometimes we get calls about on the telephone from a call center consultant and don't really grasp too well.
Okay, so gap cover really fits in with your medical aid. Gap cover is an insurance product that enables a policyholder when they go into hospital and they have some kind of a surgery, either it's some kind of a procedure. What happens often is the medical practitioner or the surgeon that's actually performing that procedure for them often charges more than the medical scheme tariff and that the medical aid is willing to pay. So, for example, in some situations it's 300 or 400% more than the medical scheme tariff that's going to be paid out.
That's a huge number.
It is a huge number, and often, obviously, in South Africa, because of the limited supply of surgeons, etc., it often gets to those kind of levels or even higher than that.
Okay.
So gap cover really is there to help a policyholder when that specific situation happens, that they can actually cover that shortfall or that gap in their cost, essentially. That's what the cover is for. It only covers for in-hospital procedures. It doesn't act as a substitute for a medical aid. It also isn't there to replace a medical aid.
It's something important that you mentioned there because it's used for in-hospital procedures only. If I have a hospital plan or hospital cover, could I get gap cover in that particular case? You
can get it, but it's not necessarily going to assist you. You need to have proper medical aid cover in place. So a hospital cash plan, for example, isn't necessarily going to assist you. We firstly wouldn't cover you at Guardrisk if you don't have a proper medical aid in place. And it's not to replace your medical cover. It's to add to be an additional top-up on top of that to cover those gaps for those procedures with surgeons, specifically in hospital.
So how would I determine whether or not I need gap cover?
If you're an individual or you have a family and you expect at any point in the future that you're going to need to go into hospital and you at the time want to be able to use the specialist of your choice, in that situation you obviously don't want to be sitting in a situation with those potential gaps or those shortfalls in your medical aid cover. In that specific situation, or generally in any hospital circumstance, you want to know that you have the peace of mind for that cover to kick in.
And generally speaking, without that gap cover, you'd have to fork out the difference from your own pocket.
Correct. And in most cases, you fork out that cover up front. That cost up front, correct.
Walk us through how long and the terms and conditions of gap cover. Do you need to have it for a certain period of time before the insurer or issuer of it actually pays up for that surgery?
So yes, we do have waiting periods or exclusion periods, as some people would call it. The exclusion period really is to prevent what we call anti-selection, where an individual knows that they're going into the hospital, they know that they're going to have costs that the medical scheme is not going to cover. In that situation, we would put in place waiting periods. That waiting period, generally on our policy specifically, the first 6 months we cover nothing. Thereafter we cover from 6 to 12 months we cover 50% of the shortfall, and after the 12 months we cover the full amount.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's the general waiting period. That's specifically for what we would call natural causes events. Accidental causes are obviously we would cover immediately. On our group schemes, on our voluntary schemes, however, it's a slightly different situation. We would have a general waiting period of 3 months overall for all of our voluntary cover.
You mentioned the discrepancy in the payments. The first 6 months, no payment. After that, 50%. How does that tie in with the actual cost that the specialist charges? And that goes back to the initial statement that you made about them charging fees that are almost 300 or even 400% over. How then, as a consumer, do I go about choosing the appropriate gap cover that will cover all the necessary costs?
So the first thing that you need to do is you need to speak to your financial advisor to understand what medical cover you have, what shortfalls you have, and what gap cover you need to have in place. One of the critical things that needs to be done by any individual is they need to make sure that they have the cover for a prolonged period of time, not just to look for the cover when they think they're going to need it. Generally, our policy is set up, or any insurer's policy will be set up in such a way to make sure that those individuals are not going to get the cover because they pre-planned the cover for the event that they needed. And in a lot of situations, we end up losing that policyholder straight after the event because the policy has paid out in the circumstance, which obviously is not fair for the rest of the policyholders, as those individuals are footing the bill for the individual that comes in and goes off quite quickly.
Let's talk about that, the cancellation rates. Can you change your gap cover as and when you want with different providers, and can you cancel it when you feel as though it's no longer necessary, and are there costs involved with such cancellation?
So there's no costs involved. You can cancel it. It's generally 30 days written notice, in which you have to cancel. Well, you can cancel the policy at least. As I said, there's no cancellations there. There shouldn't be any barriers to taking a policy from one provider to another provider. In most circumstances, an insurer, if they know that a policyholder has come off an existing policy, as long as they put the new policy in place immediately, so there's no period of time where there's no cover in place. If that individual transitions over to a new policy, there should be no waiting periods either.
Just on the types of costs, because obviously medical aid, number one, is very expensive for many South Africans. The kind of contributions that one is expected to make on gap cover or to gap cover, how much are we looking here?
So on a monthly basis, a policyholder is looking anywhere, depending on the option that they choose, anywhere between about 100 and 250 Rand a month. The average is round about between 160 and 170 Rand a month. So it's not a lot of money, and it does obviously offer that cover, but the critical thing to note is it does not cover the hospitalisation. It is only for the cover of the specialists that are in excess of the medical scheme rate while they're in hospital.
Tell us about that, because it seems as though it's a common misconception and maybe a trap that a lot of consumers tend to fall into.
It is. It's actually, obviously gap cover is fairly new in the market, so it's the buzzword at the moment. One of the things that a lot of consumers, when they elect to purchase the cover and become policyholders, one of the things that we often find is their assumption is that the cover that they get from their medical aid relative to the cover, to the cost of their medical services, everything that falls in between is what is covered by gap cover, and that is definitely not the case. To operate as such, we would actually be operating outside of the demarcation rules of the Registrar of Medical Schemes, and we are an insurer. So any service provider or any insurer that's operating in that space is very clear as to what they will and won't cover to ensure that they don't cross those lines of demarcation.
And I take it this falls on the medical aid holder to actually ask the questions as to what does it exclude?
It's a combination. I think it's firstly it falls on the responsibility of the financial advisor that policyholder is dealing with. It is also obviously our responsibility to ensure that we communicate that the policy wording and the terms and conditions. And I think finally, and probably most critically, it's the responsibility of the policyholder to read their policy wording and understand what they have.
Exactly. Is there ever a time where one might forfeit their claim if they use it fraudulently, or maybe fraudulently, but they're actually not aware of the fact that they're doing so?
We do get a lot of claims. It's very difficult to operate fraudulently without without the participation of a medical services provider. So a medical practitioner would have to participate, in that fraud at the same time. That doesn't happen often. I mean, it's certainly not something that we see on a regular basis. We often get policyholders that don't understand their benefits, so they submit claims. Those claims are rejected because it's in a lot of cases, in most cases, it's for hospitalisation costs. And then obviously we have aggrieved policyholders on our hands. That again goes back to consumer education, and really the responsibility of both the insurer, well, all three, the insurer, the financial advisor and the policyholder, all making sure that the information is accurate and is available for the policyholder to read.
And are there typical mistakes that are made when the policyholder actually submits their claim for gap cover?
Typical mistakes, not really.
Maybe important documentation that needs to be included and the likes.
The human factor, the human behaviour factor. Individuals will submit their claims, so their medical statements, etc., and they'll forget to submit the claim form. Or they'll send the claim form and they'll forget to add the doctor's account. It's just those kind of things that cause delays in claim payments. But for the most part, as long as a policyholder reads their policy documents, reads their claim form, they'll submit the correct information.
Joanne, because it is all about the money and the money that actually comes out of the consumer's pocket, you mentioned the average price sitting at around 170 Rand for gap cover in
Correct.
the country. Does that correlate to the percentage of gap cover? Now, I want to go into that 100%, 200%, where I think a lot of consumers often tend to get lost there. Is there a particular maximum on the amount that gap cover can cover, meaning 400% or 500 or
500%.
500%. There we go.
Yes.
So that's the key limit. And does that correlate with the 170 you'd be paying a month?
It does, otherwise we would be making losses.
Exactly, which is not what we want. Joanne, we've said quite a bit on gap cover, but if you could sum it up for us tonight?
Sure. I think it's the essential points or the critical points are if you have medical aid and you think or expect that you're going to be in hospital at some point in the near or distant future, ensure that you have gap cover. Make sure that you understand what your terms and conditions are. Make sure that you understand the policy. And if you don't understand the policy, speak to your financial advisor or contact your insurer.
Mm-hmm. Just to close off with, before we wrap up the conversation,
Yes.
there might be someone out there who has gap cover and actually hasn't used it over the last, let's say 3 years, for example. Can they get a claim on some of the contributions that they've made, or just cancel and cut your losses?
It's a pure risk policy, so we don't provide for any investment income or investment return on those. It is a pure risk policy.
Joanne, thank you so much for your time this evening.
With
Demystifying gap cover for us tonight. That's where we leave it for Personal Finance tonight. A big thank you once more to Joanne Gloag, Executive of Admed at Guardrisk. To remember that we want to hear from you and share your thoughts with us. You can send your comments or tweets to @CNBC Africa using the hashtag Finance410 or to myself @Gukumfupi on Twitter. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.